Hey, it's Jose Galison. You're watching No Way Jose. You can find me on the No Way Jose YouTube channel. You can also find me on all the major audio podcatchers and Odyssey as well. Credit to at jcamp1521 for the intro. He does a lot of other stuff like that. So if you're looking for a commission, commission him for some podcast work, whether it be editing or intros or whatever. He's the guy for you. Today, my guest is David Friedman. Yes, the great David Friedman, the author of Machinery of Freedom. So just so you guys know what's going on, the template today is a live stream if you're catching the 22nd. If not, you'll get it publicly available about a week later if you don't catch the public live stream. If you want to be able to get it in that meantime, you got to give me money. Patreon.com, just No Way Jose 2020. The lowest level is $2. Highest level is 20. My highest level is my sponsors. My sponsors are C.D. McRae of the Whiskey and Tea podcast, Jacob Winograd of the Daniel 3 podcast, who covers a lot of biblical anarchy type content. I have Brandon Smith on Twitter. He's underscore 2D System. He also has 2D System on YouTube and Rumble and on Spotify as well. He has a lot of audio, like music type content. And yeah, like I said, give me money if you want to support that. Today, the topic, I'm calling this debate prep, just like I did with Stefan. It'll be kind of a similar thing like I did with Stefan, where we kind of define terms because everyone kind of has their terms a little bit differently. So we got to make sure we're on the same page there. And also kind of where these individuals are coming from. Because we kind of initially started out as maybe a debate, some sort of debate, conversation, crossover. We'll see where it goes. And you know, as deep of as a topic as this is, I found out real quick these guys have very nuanced positions on these. So I kind of got to see where they're coming from, nail them down so I can come up with a good God, I'm a brain fart, a good debate proposition, essentially. Or it may not even be a debate, may end up being a discussion. But, you know, I really got to figure out the details with something like this. But it kind of worked out having them come on and give their positions on these different topics. But, yeah, like I said, I have that Kinsella one. So that one's already out. You can go check that out one. That one was really good. Just a reminder, tomorrow, another Tower Power Hour comes out for those who like that show. As always, go check out TopLobsta, toplobsta.com. Use Jose at checkout for 10% off. With that, let's go ahead and not waste any more of David's time, and we'll get going on this. Hey, David.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for joining me. It's a great honor. I've already covered one of your works before in the show because I'm doing an anarchist handbook series, and I covered the excerpt of Machinery of Freedom that Malice picked for that book. I got Jeremy Kaufman to cover it with me. It went really well. So. I know you. Jeremy said he's familiar with you, and you guys are familiar with each other. So I figured you might take something out of that. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself for my audience, so they know who you are. So for those who don't know, I know obviously I do, but if you want to take a moment and let them know who you are, what you're about.
My name is David Friedman. I'm an academic economist with a doctorate in physics who spent about 35 years in law schools, teaching and studying mostly the application of economics to law, which has been my specialty for quite a while, although I wrote on other things before that. My first book was called The Machinery of Freedom, Guide to a Radical Capitalism, and it was in part a defense of libertarian views in general, but in addition to that, a sketch of what a society which had private property and trade but did not have government might look like. So I was describing a conjectural anarcho-capitalist society. I've written a fair number of books since then, and my most recent book, it was a book called Legal Systems Very Different from Ours, which came out of a seminar that I taught for many years at Santa Clara University's law school. And one of the things I concluded from the research that went into that was that my first book, I was in some sense reinventing the wheel. That is to say that although I was describing a conjectural, modern, high division of labor society without a government, that more primitive versions of more or less what I was describing had in fact existed in a variety of times and places. And that wasn't what the book was about. The book included several such societies and one chapter on how they work, but it included a lot of other things as well that I found interesting. Other than that, I've published 3 novels, 2 of them fantasy and one of them labeled fantasy, but really a historical novel with made-up history because I didn't have any magic or elves or dwarves or any of that sort of stuff in it. And as I say, a fair variety of nonfiction books. I have a webpage, daviddfriedman.com. A fair amount of my work, including several books, and most of my articles can be read for free from the webpage. I write mainly to spread ideas, not mainly as an income source. And others of my things you can get on Amazon. Not sure what else is useful to tell you. I'm currently retired. With luck, I'm going to be in Europe in another month or so giving speeches, but that depends on COVID not going up again. So
Yeah,
let's talk about whatever you want to talk about.
We got Russia to worry about. COVID's not a thing anymore. We're good. But I think the thing a lot of people know you for is, or maybe gets associated with you, which you'll get a chance today to kind of clear that up or solidify this as being, the truth essentially, is you're well known for consequentialism. Is that kind of is your stance of coming from things? And
that's an oversimplification.
Yes,
exactly.
There are
really two different issues that you want to consider. One of them is how to reach your conclusions, and one of them is how to persuade other people of your conclusions. So my moral position is what is called Intuitionism. Mike Humer has a book on it, which is a more sophisticated version than my accounts of it, in which I think one has moral intuitions, one observes situations and reacts to them just as one sees things. And I think there is some reason to believe that those intuitions reflect correct moral judgments. So I'm in that sense a moral realist. I might be wrong, but my guess is that it really is wrong in something to, torture small children for the fun of it, say, not just it happens to be my taste, not to. And so from that standpoint, what trying to make sense of my intuitions, I can't describe the result in either pure consequentialist or pure deontological terms. That is to say, I can imagine situations where my best estimate is that doing X will have on the whole positive results, and I'm still against doing it. But I can also imagine situations, and I discuss a number of them in my book, where doing X appears to violate what I think of as people's rights, but it provides a very large benefit in other terms at a relatively small cost and rights violation. I'm in favor of it too. So in that sense, I'm really not willing to accept either a pure consequentialist or a pure natural rights, deontological, or whatever position, because I think both of them I can show lead to conclusions I don't believe in. On the other hand, in terms of persuading other people, I don't think that either I or anyone else has anything approaching a proof of what the correct moral views are. So if I say you shouldn't do this because it violates rights, the person I speak to can perfectly reasonably say, why shouldn't that violate rights? And I don't really have an adequate answer to that question. And on the other hand, I think if you look at the moral views that most people have, they correlate quite a lot. That is, people don't agree perfectly. That indeed is the fact that they correlate is part of my evidence that intuitionism is really an observation, but that's a separate issue. But they correlate enough, given that I think that the institutions I am in favor of are quite a lot better in my terms than the institutions I am opposing. If that's right, then it is likely that they are not only better in terms of my values, better in terms of most people's values. And if that's right, then the sensible way of persuading people is not to try to persuade them that my morals are right, but try to persuade them that my economics are right, and that therefore the results of what I want will, in the long run, be more attractive than the results of what they think they want, of what I'm arguing against. So I'm a consequentialist in an argumentative sense, and I suppose a mixed consequentialist. I don't want to say quite deontological, because deontological implies an infinite strength for your moral beliefs, and I don't think I have that, but a consequentialist and I suppose a natural rights believer, a mix of those two in terms of my own beliefs about how I reach conclusions. So it's a little complicated, but I think that describes my position.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, I haven't heard that take on it from you before, so I kind of thought it was something along those lines, that you wouldn't be a straight up consequentialist, and that does make sense. I actually do think that arguing from a consequentialist perspective, I mean, there is some merit to arguing from a moralist perspective, but it depends. I mean, generally speaking, I think if you can make the argument from a consequentialist perspective to someone, it really does. It clears things up a lot for them. But
I'm an economist, so I believe in the division of labor. And if you are really good at passionate moral rhetoric and really bad at economics, it might make sense to use the moral rhetoric to try to persuade people, but I think there will be a noticeable number of people you cannot persuade that way. And they're right not to be persuaded in a sense, because you don't have any good proof that your moral rhetoric is right.
Yes.
One of the things that struck me going over a part of Ayn Rand's most famous novel is that when there's a hole in her argument, she covers it up with emotive rhetoric. And she's very good at that because she's a very skilled writer. But it's still pretty striking if you're actually trying to turn Galt's speech into a logical argument. And you say, well, step C doesn't actually follow from step B. Oh, but if you don't believe in step C, you're a horrible person and you're against life and all the rest of this stuff. So I discussed some of that. I have a chapter in, I should say, I have a high opinion of Rand. She was obviously very bright, very creative, very courageous woman. I just think she was wrong in a bunch of things. And I have one chapter in Machinery of Freedom, which is essentially taking the argument as she gives it. Now, maybe there's some other objectivist who can give a better version, but the argument as she gives it in Galt's speech, and showing, I think, that there are gaping holes in it, so that her conclusion does not actually follow from her argument.
Yeah, you definitely fleshed out a little bit there, kind of what I was trying to get at. That I do think, generally speaking, I guess you bring up a good point with the division of labor. I think making the moral argument is usually easier, but I think if you've gone to a little bit higher level in certain aspects of being able to make consequential arguments, I think those are more persuasive, generally.
Well, part of the problem is that almost nobody who makes the moral argument really believes in it. Mm-hmm. That is to say, if you try to state the natural rights position in a reasonably clean and tidy sense, you end up with a conclusion which no one believes in. And that's been a problem for a very long time. My favorite example, which is not mine, it was from Bill Bradford, who was the editor of Liberty, no longer alive, unfortunately, but a neat guy. And he says, all right, you're on the balcony of your 10th floor apartment. You carelessly fall off. By great good luck, the 9th floor apartment underneath you has a balcony with a flagpole sticking out, and it's a very strong flagpole. So you catch hold of the flagpole and you start going hand over hand to the balcony in order to get off. And the owner of the apartment comes in and says, I'm not giving you permission to use my flagpole. Please let go. All right. Are there any libertarians who will let go under those circumstances? There might be some who say they ought to, but won't, that's a failure of their morality. But I don't think anybody really believes it. So in order to make a natural rights argument, a rights position coherent, I'm not sure it's impossible, but you would have to make it very complicated. And that's not what people who are actually making those arguments are normally doing. So in that sense, that's my real complaint, as it were, about the natural rights argument by libertarians, that it sounds great until you start looking for situations where it implies conclusions you don't believe in. Yeah. There are a variety of others of that sort.
All right. Well, I want to take a little back to basics. I want to get you to define terms as you see them, so that we can work from. When you say something like deontology, what do you mean specifically?
What I mean is the idea that there are certain actions which one is forbidden to take, which people are forbidden to take, that certain actions are inherently morally wrong, independent of their consequences. So an obvious example would be that murdering people is always wrong. Now, one might be a deontologist and not believe that. One might have a fancier version in which, probably depends on your definition of murder, of course. I think nobody believes that killing people is always wrong, because most people believe in self-defense. But a statement like that, or taking other people's property, is always wrong. And that particular one, of course, is another one where a libertarian who runs into a sophisticated opponent is going to have a serious problem, because the question is, why is it your property? And, if you think about, we have this pretty story about how we get land by mixing our labor with the land, but that's not really how we got it. The land we own very likely was stolen from somebody at some point in the past. So how do we have a good claim to it? If we don't have a good claim to it, how do we have a good claim to the fruit grown on the trees in my backyard, et cetera, et cetera? So that it seems to me what seem like clean, tidy arguments are nice, tidy, sort of first approximation arguments. But if you're against somebody who's got enough sense to actually think about them and work through, it is hard to make a satisfactory defense. On the other hand, it seems to me that one can use economics proofs are pretty scarce in this world. You can use economics to show good reasons to believe that institutions that with the governments that can redistribute income are likely to have bad consequences. To take much simpler, it's pretty easy to show that as a rule, restrictions on foreign trade, tariffs, for example, on net make people worse off. And you can then have complicated arguments with a sufficiently sophisticated person about what on net makes people worse off means. But I think if you push that through all the way, it's pretty clear that it corresponds to things which most people would view as usually making people worse off, even with somewhat different definitions of what that meant. So I think you can get quite a lot out of economics, and I'm not sure you can get a lot out of moral philosophy.
Yeah.
Different way, because I like to point it, there's a reason why philosophers still read Aristotle and physicists and economists don't.
All right. Now, consequentialism. How would you define that in your own terms?
The idea that your moral judgment of an act depends only on its consequences, or perhaps only on what you can reasonably expect its consequences to be. As one could be a consequentialist and saying you're acting correctly in that situation, even though it turns out that for reasons you couldn't possibly know, it has the bad consequences. But basically, that acts are to be judged by their consequences and only by their consequences.
Yeah. What about utilitarianism? I only bring this up because it's one that's kind of mismatched with
a particular form of consequentialism, which people occasionally claim that I believe in, not having noticed that the entry in the Index of Machinery of Freedom for utilitarian is utilitarian, why I am not. But yeah, it's the idea that you can think of each person's life as getting a certain amount of happiness. And happiness, exactly how you define it, is sort of fuzzy, but called utility. And that the appropriate moral position is to take those actions that maximize the sum of human happiness, or in some versions, the average of human happiness. I actually have an old published article, chapter in somebody else's book, in which I'm looking at the interesting problem of how you would compare alternative futures with different numbers of people in them. Because if it's the sum, then each additional person, as long as he has any happiness at all, is a gain. Whereas if it's the average, then an additional person below average is a loss. And that's a problem with a lot of people who think they're utilitarians, haven't thought through very carefully. And I discuss that and offer a possible, very imperfect way of comparing such societies that avoids those problems.
I'm kind of curious. I didn't have this in my notes, and I wasn't planning to bring it up, but this is something that came up with Stefan, and this also, I think, just kind of naturally works into this conversation when it comes to this ethical values or theories or whatever. What are your thoughts on the argumentation ethics from Hoppe? If you're familiar with them,
from what I've seen of it, it's complete nonsense.
Okay,
that is to say, if it were true, then nobody would ever have made any arguments at all for libertarianism, because nobody has ever lived in a perfectly libertarian society. But of course, it is not true, because if you lived in a society in which you were a slave half the time and free half the time, which is not a libertarian society, you could still do your arguing during the half of the time you were free.
Yeah.
Now, you can find that on my webpage, because I had a brief piece in Liberty magazine back. I used to be one of the, everyone they called it, associate editors or something, which meant that I wrote from time to time. And I have a piece on the argumentation ethics. I could probably, with a little effort, even find it. It's if you go to my webpage and go to there's a section on stuff of interest to libertarians, and it was one of my Liberty columns, and in which I went through why it seemed to me that argument was nonsense. Now, Hoppe in general, I have a negative impression of him, but I haven't really read enough of his stuff to know if that impression is justified or not.
Okay, fair enough. You flatly reject it. I'm not gonna go to the minutia. I'm very much a person that I neither accept nor reject it. It's something I've been on the fence for a while, so it's not even like a big deal for me. It makes sense if you're taking deontological position or marrying the two, consequentialism and deontology, that you would take.
It only makes sense if the argument is right.
Yes.
If the argument isn't right, then it does not make sense.
All right. How do you define a libertarian? Because I do think this kind of plays into this
Sure.
question when it comes to
I
this
don't
type of thing.
think that one should try to have a bright line definition. That is, I think the real issue is not so much are you a libertarian or aren't you, as how libertarian are you. And I would say that a libertarian is somebody who puts a high value on individual liberty, whether as a means or an end. That is, I would say that somebody who is actually a utilitarian, but who believes that a free society will have more utility, is then also a libertarian. Similarly, somebody who believes that what is right is what God says, but believe God says that you want to have a free society, he's a libertarian too. So I don't think that I would want to define libertarian by where you got the conclusion from, but by having that conclusion. And then the conclusion can be held with, I guess I would have said that somebody who believes that a society, that the freest society that is possible is one with a government, is still as much of a libertarian as an anarcho-capitalist is. They just have a different opinion about how to achieve maximum liberty. So on the other hand, I would say that somebody who says, well, liberty is all very nice, but here are some important other things that I'm willing to trade off liberty for, to the extent he says that, he is less of a libertarian than he otherwise would be. And in that sense, I'm not 100% libertarian, because I could imagine circumstances in which I would be willing to trade off liberty for some other things. Yes, I was just looking at my own webpage, and the relevant article is titled On Hoppy, and it's on my webpage /libertarian/libertarian.html under a section on articles and liberty, written a long time ago.
Okay, so do you consider yourself a libertarian? I guess you kind of answered that a little bit there.
I think I'm a libertarian, but I could imagine somebody who was, by my definition, more libertarian than I was.
Okay.
Someone who said that even if not violating somebody's rights by a little bit resulted in 100 million people dying, I'm still in favor of not doing it as long as their dying doesn't violate their rights.
So is this in a certain sense you kind of somewhat intrinsically accepting the definition of libertarian being at its root in a certain sense kind of deontological? Just doesn't mean you have to be, or NAP or property rights or something along those lines related, because it kind of seems that you're kind of alluding to it, but maybe I'm
well, except you could have lots of different deontological views. So it's just I think words rarely have really precise meanings, but I think but I should say I'm oversimplifying a little bit, because libertarian in the sense we use it includes roughly a particular view of what sort of rights people have. So that if somebody says I'm in favor of maximizing human liberty and people who don't have enough to eat aren't free, and therefore people should be compelled to provide food to other people, that's not a libertarian in the sense we're using the term, even though he would perfectly reasonably say, I want to maximize liberty, he just has a different definition. So I think there's a set of ideas of what we mean by liberty, which really have to do with individuals controlling themselves, individuals having control over property they have produced or justly gotten. You could make a long list of it and it gets complicated, but not everybody who would describe himself as in favor of liberty is a libertarian, because the word liberty has to mean something. Yeah.
I only bring this up because, this is obviously something that would likely come up in a future discussion of this ilk, and it's not at all to criticize. I mean, if I had a position and someone says that makes you less of a libertarian, I'd be like, okay, if you say so. I mean, it's just a word. It's not something to get caught up on. But I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on the non-aggression principle, and if it has any inadequacies you might see.
It is a good first approximation.
Yeah.
That's all it is. So the standard example that I've used for a long time is, suppose there is an asteroid which is heading for Earth, and it's big enough that if it hits Earth, it will wipe out all life on Earth. And it happens through some bizarre sequence of events that there is a way of stopping the asteroid. But in order to stop it, you will have to steal something worth a nickel from its rightful owner, who, as it happens, has nothing against having life wiped out on Earth. All right. Do you do it?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is yes. But that's clearly a violation of the non-aggression principle, because the asteroid is not aggressing against anybody. It's not a person. It's just a natural event. And I can think of other examples. The other standard one I've used is to imagine there's a madman who's shooting a bunch of people. You have access to a rifle, but it's not yours. You know that the owner of the rifle has publicly said that he doesn't want anybody else to use it without his permission. Do you pick up the rifle and shoot the madman to save everybody's life? Yes, you do. But again, now that one you could say one interpretation of the non-coercion principle as one interpretation is you should never initiate coercion. A different interpretation is you should so act as to minimize the amount of initiation of coercion. So on the second definition, the stealing the rifle is still consistent with the non-initiation principle, but stopping the asteroid isn't.
Mm-hmm. I just saw Annika Rika in the chat. Debate prep. Who will be debating? This was supposedly, we may or may not set up something with Stefan Kinsella and David Friedman, something along the lines of consequentialism, or I guess not even necessarily consequentialism, and then it's something along those lines between consequentialism and deontology. Although neither of them specifically ascribe themselves to either of those categories, but there's definitely room for discussion in there. So one way or another, we'll make something happen probably. But that's what's going on, Erica Rica. Stefan, obviously, and it actually works as a good example to kind of demonstrate these ethical values at odds here. He kind of wanted me to bring up IP. And so he wants to ask if you think, and I guess he says your position on IP is in some aspects you're okay with it. But he wants to know if you think it would be illegitimate from an NAP or deontological perspective. But then I guess I'll give you kind of a chance to explain that, because I believe, I may be wrong, you have supported IP in certain aspects, and I'm assuming this is where your consequentialism comes in mind. Or maybe I'm wrong. I'm not sure.
My position on IP is that I am the only libertarian alive who doesn't have a position on IP.
Okay.
That is to say that I think there are arguments for it and there are arguments against it. And that is true from both a moral and a consequentialist, from both a natural rights and a consequentialist standpoint. That from a consequentialist standpoint, well, that would be a long argument, but I spend a chapter on my book, Law's Order, which is about economic analysis of law, working through the arguments for and against IP. And I argue essentially, these are all consequentialist arguments. This is economic efficiency. And I argue that the case for copyright as traditionally defined is stronger than the case for patent as traditionally defined, but I don't conclude that either that one of them is and one of them shouldn't exist. And I think that from the moral standpoint, it is not at all clear that you could argue that all IP is doing is it's a proxy for enforcing contracts that you're entitled to enforce. That is to say, I sell you my book with the explicit agreement that you won't let anybody else copy it. And we then say, I sell the book to 1,000 people that way. After a while, I observe pirated copies showing up. I have no way of knowing who has violated that contract, and therefore I'm stuck, and yet somebody must have. So you can think of IP as sort of an imperfect way of preventing one rights violation at the cost of another, so to speak. So I don't think it's clear. I think if you look at the position of libertarians, I'm probably not literally the only person who doesn't have a clear position, but as far as I can tell, Ayn Rand thought that IP was the most defensible form of property. And I'm pretty sure that Murray Rothbard thought it was the least defensible form of property. Certainly some people in his tradition do.
Well, all right, I see Oscar in the chat. He's saying ask you about sci-fi and war games. You're going to probably have to reframe that. I don't know if maybe you have something to say in that, but it doesn't really sound like a fully formed question to me, Oscar.
That is war games. I have not played any war games for a very long time. When I was much younger, when I was about high school age, when I was 12 or 13 or 14, I spent lots of time playing Avalon Hill war games, mostly with myself, and some other things later for a fair while. It got much easier when you could do it on a computer. In fact, you could do it by yourself on a computer, because the computer could be your enemy. As far as science fiction is concerned, I've read quite a lot of it. I could, describe authors I particularly like. I think C.J. Cherryh is very good. I think Lois Bujold is very good. I like Heinlein. I think Werner Vinge is pretty good. There are other, it would be a long list. Poul Anderson's pretty good. A lot of people, I could say. I have not written any science fiction that people, I sometimes asserted that I have, but as I was saying before, 2 of my novels are fantasy in the sense that they have magic, though it's a rather scientific kind of magic. And one of them is neither science fiction nor fantasy. It's in a genre that doesn't have a name that I know of, but it's basically a historical novel with made up history in which you have a world whose institutions are loosely based on real world institutions, but put together in a way in which they weren't actually at any time and place in the real world.
All right. I don't know if you meant with the war games. I remember you had that section in Machinery of Freedom where you talk about, say things like paintball or video games or
I see.
or stuff like that. Yeah, maybe that's what he's getting at. I don't know.
What that's about. This is the 3rd edition. Basically, there's a chapter in the 1st edition on how a stateless society might defend itself, and then another chapter in the 3rd edition. And in the 3rd edition, I'm suggesting that one possibility is to leverage the fact that many people enjoy playing at war for the fun of it. And if you combine that with patriotism, as it were, with people liking their own society, you could then imagine a situation where you have, in effect, a large volunteer militia at a very low cost, that you have people who are training to defend the society if it's invaded, but they're doing it in the form of war games, just as real soldiers do war games, only they're doing it for the fun rather than to win future battles. And you then would have some professionals, but they would be essentially supported by charity, by people making donations because they want to protect their society. And I start out with a Kipling short story. I'm also a Kipling fan, and the short story is a fictional account of a legal system he imagines in England, where you have a huge number of trained soldiers because military training is sort of replaced cricket, as it were, as what people do. And his system, it's not a stateless society, so it's not the same thing. But I thought the guts idea and Kipling's a very good writer, were very nicely handled, to imagine a society where part of what you did, both for entertainment and for status, was to spend a certain amount of time on training as a soldier and having competitions in which you're fighting against other people, but you're not using real bullets, basically, and you have referees who decide who's won and so forth. And it was neatly done. And I then went on to talk about paintball as a quite large scale version of that, Society for Creative Anachronism, which I've been involved in, and is something somewhat similar, although the weaponry is not very useful for modern warfare, since it's swords and shields and such. But the general attitude is, and so forth. So that was the context. But I haven't actually, I've done SCA for a long time, but I haven't done any. You could think of SCA as wargaming at a scale of 1 inch to 1 inch, but in any case, I haven't done ordinary wargaming. My younger son does a whole lot of computer wargaming.
Have you read any of the Dune books at all?
I read the original Dune book,
yeah,
and I enjoyed it, but not enormously.
Okay.
I gather from what people say that the later books are less good, and so I have not actually read them.
Okay. I mean, I disagree with that a little bit. I'd say like it peaks like halfway through the series and then it goes down, but I don't know. Whatever. We're not going to quibble about that. I enjoyed them. I figured you may as well. Especially, it's a very much a series that intertwines a lot of political philosophy and such.
Yes.
Well, with that, I think we surprisingly were really concise and handled a lot of this topic. So we're going to do plugs, but if you're in the chat and you want to ask any questions, now is your last call.
How do I get it? How do I get it in? Let me see where the chat is.
Oh, it's just I don't even know how you would open it.
I see private chat there.
Yeah,
maybe you look at comments in here. I see the comments.
Yeah. There hasn't been a lot, so if any more comes up, but I just figured we'd do plugs, and if any came up in the meantime, we'd read them. So I have but a meager following. So But if you want to go ahead and drop your plugs, and if any pop up in the meantime, we'll address them.
Sure. I guess the only thing that I would want, if I can figure out how I do it, I'm not sure how I write in this. I see how I read. But this is, do I have to log in or something?
I don't know if you can do it as a guest on StreamYard.
I'm not seeing an input, and I'm not seeing any place on this comments thing where I can write, only where I can read.
I mean, you may have to do it on YouTube. I'm not sure if you can do it as a guest. Private chat would be me and you. I know you can do that. The public one, I'm not sure if you can do that on your end or not.
Yes, because the only thing I would want to do is to tell people my webpage, which is daviddfriedman.com, which is pretty easy to remember. D is my middle initial. If I'd applied for the URL 6 months earlier, I could have gotten davidfriedman.com, but somebody beat me to it.
Yeah, I'll be sure to add that whenever I post this publicly later. Because like I said at the beginning, I do a live stream, then I take it down and put it behind a paywall, and then a week later I put it up. But yeah, with that, yeah, someone said loved watching your dad. For those who aren't aware, yes, his dad is Milton Friedman. So, yeah, with that, my show is you've been watching can you ask David Friedman if Nick Land is right about capitalism being artificial intelligence? I'm not too familiar with Nick Land. I'm not sure if you are, or if you've heard this argument before.
I know the name, and I don't think I have seen it, but there is a sense in which it is true. That is, it is true that a market does what a sufficiently clever computer would do, namely solves in a decentralized way a set of optimization problems, so to speak. So I don't know if I wouldn't be surprised if Nick Land makes the point in that way, but that would be the obvious way of making it.
All right. Well, with that, this has been you're watching No Way Jose. You can find me on YouTube, all the major audio podcatchers, Odyssey as well. Follow me at Twitter at 2020 No Way Jose. If you want to give me money, patreon.com, just No Way Jose 2020. Like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. Thank you again, David. This has been great. It was a real honor having you on. Hopefully we can set something up between maybe you and Stefan, or maybe it's you and someone else. If Stefan doesn't feel like he has something viable to, kind of be at odds with in this discussion. So, because he ended up I think he's used. What did you say your position was? It wasn't even deontological. I'm gonna have to Intuitionism. I'll have to look into that more later. But yeah, with that, we are out. I appreciate your time and appreciate everyone who came. And with that, we are out.
Thank you.